I would now like to introduce my distinguished panellists, if I may. We start off with Tassos Aniotis, who is currently Acting Deputy Director General and Director of Strategy, Simplification and Policy Analysis in the European Commission's DG Agri. The senior official holds a PhD and a Master of Science in Agricultural Economics and has previously served as Deputy Chef de Cabinet for the ex-Farm Commissioner Franz Fischler. Since joining the department dealing with agriculture and rural development in the late 1980s, that's quite a career, Tassos. He has obviously been very heavily involved in the evolution of the EU's farm policy. Sébastien Treillet, who is Executive Director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, since January 2019. Sébastien joined the Paris-based institute in 2010 as Director of Programmes. He is also Chairman of the Scientific and Technical Committee of the French Global Environment Facility. Sébastien holds a PhD in environmental management and plays a key role in informing policy in the area of sustainable development at both French and EU level. Nathalie Chaz, who is Director for Food Sustainability and International Relations in the Commission's Director General for Health and Food Safety. Between 2014 and 2019, she was Deputy Head of Cabinet for the then Commissioner for Health and Food Safety, Vytenis Andriukaitis, a lawyer by training. Natalie previously worked in DG Trade and was posted in the European delegation to the WTO in Geneva before joining DG Santé. So that'll be interesting later on. We might tease out some details on the trade perspective. And finally, we have Dick Goedhoff, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, who is joining us online. Welcome, Dick. Good to see you. Who is the chairman of the supervisory board for CZWA, a Dutch cooperative in southern Netherlands, which includes 3,100 active agricultural entrepreneurs engaged in all matters of farming sectors. Dick is also a 14th generation farmer and managing partner of Novi Farm. And in 2007, his good work paid off when he and his team won the Agricultural Enterprise of the Year award. So I'd like to give my panelists a very warm welcome. So Tassos, let's start with you. I would like to invite you to take the floor and deliver your key message, and I would ask you to stick to the 7-minute time slot if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To take the floor, I need to take my mask off temporarily, and welcome everybody here, including my friend Eric, who really introduced the topic in a manner that raises, if you want, more questions than answers. So as an aborted academic myself that opted many, many years ago not to do an academic career in the US, but cross the Atlantic to face at the end of the career the type of criticism we face on the CAP, let me start with one very brief comment. Assume that somebody, and this somebody should be a noble politician, were to say, we want to end violence. We want to have peace. Nobody would take this as an area of criticism or something that will happen. It would be an aspiration. But this is a noble aspiration, so there is no problem. If, on the other hand, we take some targets that are really ambitious and we put them in a strategy, damned if you do and damned if you don't. So clearly, the Farm to Fork strategy raises the bar very high. And it raises the bar in many areas where you can raise valid concerns and questions whether they're going to be achieved. And as somebody that has been around in 6 reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy, one thing that I would like to say that for me, what has always been important is not so much the initial speed of reform, and I'd be off an official line here, but it's the direction of change that matters. Because if you start in a path where you cannot turn back, acceleration of change will come when people start realizing that what they do makes sense or doesn't make sense. So the first way to judge this, and I will go a little bit back on something that is beyond our control. Eric, you were part of the initiation of the impact assessment of the Common Agricultural Policy proposal, and that was a real impact assessment. If I remember well, you did also the part on the antibiotics and health. Wasn't you?
No, it wasn't me.
It wasn't you. Some academic anyway did it. But that process started in January 2017. And the cap is going to be implemented in the 1st of January 2023, with the strategic plans already having certain unknowns. So whether we like it or we don't like it, this is the process on the basis of which we have to do policy and follow policy. Now, what do we know about this policy from these studies? And the study of the GRC is something that I asked for, not as an impact assessment of the farm to fork strategy, but something very clear. When we made the proposal for the Common Agricultural Policy, we didn't do a scenario, a preferred one. We didn't want to cook the results. We stressed 3 scenarios, 1 economic, 1 environmental, 1 more social, and we came up with the results. And then we synthesized in the proposal the best elements, and we dropped what we thought was more problematic. We never had the time to update the baseline, and we said we're going to do the update integrating what came in the meantime, which is exactly these targets. Now, there are 2 ways of addressing this study. One is to say, look what it shows. Europe will go down in terms of production, and therefore we have to stop and wait until we have a miraculous cumulative impact assessment that will do everything under the sun. The other way of criticizing is, well, look at what they didn't do, look what they missed, drop it. I think if we look carefully into what it is in this study, and it is mainly on the farm side that is important, we will see, first of all, a very detailed description of what I would like to call, from an academic background, the revealed preferences of member states. We put at the regional level what we expected member states to do on the basis of what they had declared so far. And that shows how far we could go and what are the limitations of this process. We also went into a lot of detail in best practices, and there is a graph that I also mentioned when I presented that in Comagri that indicates what different best practices do and indicates that the weight of each best practice is not the same. And we made it very clear that what we also need to be able to achieve better targets and more ambitious targets is to introduce new technologies. And new technologies cover the full spectrum of practices. And we have presented in our agricultural conferences what best practices do, whether it's organic, whether it's agroecology, whether it's precision farming and conventional agriculture. And we did that in order to be able to indicate that, yes, these are results that come under certain assumptions, but if you change the assumptions, something different could happen. And that was the criticism we had in the first USDA study. The second one was much better because it included technological adjustment. So when it comes on the farm side, I think this study, without being perfect, uses as much as it can existing information. And now let me go to what information doesn't exist and why. We had to struggle a lot on what happens with consumer behavior, not only for the aspects that Nathalie would mention, but because all the analysis we're doing looks at what consumption is also doing, what demand is doing. And I'm still waiting for 8 years now, the data that supposedly a CEO of a very big retail company in Europe would give us to allow us to know how consumers react on Fridays and Saturdays, where you have the big discounts and where you realize what is consumer behavior, which is the price response of consumers. We don't have it, so what we had to do is the best that we had, which is an annual price of producers with all the other assumptions. So if anybody has better information, please give it to us. But if you don't, please think, and it's not a criticism to me, it's to the colleagues that had to try hard to do this, what I had to face. And what we did is we took into account the trends and we increased the elasticity of demand, assuming that this will reflect better consumer response. Now, when it comes to, and that's the last point because I think I'm running out of time, when it comes to the assumption of leakage, we know very well that we're not going to be alone in this world. That's a global challenge. And what we wanted to reveal is what happens if Europe acts alone, so we can strengthen the argument that others will come on board. And others are coming on board, which means that when we look at the overall situation, we have to take into account very clearly what are the limitations of this study, but at the same time, what are the real gains that this study indicates that are really possible. And I agree with you, 2030 is almost there. So it's about time we start. Thank you.
Thank you,
Let me
Tassos.
mask
Right
myself
on the
again.
nose, right on the nose is the 7 minutes. Thank you for sticking within the time slot. Sébastien, you're going to brief us on a recent IDRI study and provide an overview of some of the EU policy conditions that are necessary for the shift towards a sustainable and resilient food system. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. I just wanted to make a first point on why targets matter and introduce the issue of structural changes. I think we really need to look at what are the targets and why we want, or how we could negotiate targets. The targets that we need to set for climate and biodiversity ambitions are targets that are set by science, that say what is needed on climate and biodiversity to ensure a safe operating space for humanity. Carbon neutrality is not discussed anymore. After the mid-century, we need to be carbon neutral. And we have same issues, same messages by science on biodiversity, not just because of its intrinsic value, but also because it's the value option it has for tomorrow's generations, and it's also a productivity factor for agriculture itself, and it's also a key dimension of water quality, and thus of our human health through a One Health process. So you can't really negotiate with science. That's one of my points on what is needed to protect biodiversity and climate. What you can negotiate, I think, is two things, and I really, again, think of the analogy with climate and carbon neutrality. You can try and negotiate the time horizon. On carbon neutrality, you might, but it's complicated, really complicated to negotiate on the time horizon. But particularly, I think we need to discuss and negotiate on the pathways to get there. And I think that's an important issue to think of the end point, and I'm not talking about 2030 necessarily, but long-term end point that is given by science. And then we discuss the pathways. And this is why I believe we really need to discuss 2030 about, is that the right, I think it's the right moment to assess if we have been able to trigger the structural changes that are necessary if we want to be consistent with the long-term goals of carbon neutrality and biodiversity protection. Like we need to discuss in Glasgow, we needed to discuss getting out of coal if we want to be consistent with carbon neutrality after 2050. So rather than negotiating down the targets in 2030, that might be the outcome. But let's discuss what are the structural changes that are needed. And I take just one example. On nitrogen, the farm-to-fork targets, minus 50% nitrogen excess, as mentioned by Eric, experts show that they are insufficient for biodiversity protection and water quality. But at the same time, what is really important is to discuss that these changes, they are not feasible if you don't multiply by 2 the area on pulses, and also get to a level of nitrogen use efficiency of 70%, which is the two are real disruptions with respect to the past trends and are linked to structural changes in the markets, in the supply chains, and in the farming systems. And so this is, I think, what we need to discuss. The idea is not to negotiate how to come back to the past trends, because they are not necessarily desirable, but to discuss what are the new economic strategies that the Green Deal intends to support in terms, and that could embed those structural changes that are necessary if we want to be on time in 2050. And then, of course, the policy conditions. And just to give examples, I think the key structural changes that are heavy points. I mean, I didn't know of hairy goals, but these are heavy discussion points in the debate that are rediversification of large cropping regions that are continuing to specialize. And this is not, it's because there are behind that lots of downstream strategies on economies of scale and massification that are completely consistent with globalization, but from which we should try to see how we can diverge. But also in some supply chains, the growth strategy will need to come from value increase rather than volume increase. And for some of them, it's about decreasing volumes, which is extremely heavy a discussion with the sector. But let me just say that in France, and it's not the only country, the discussion with the livestock production sector is already on that terms. How can we negotiate a decrease in volumes and an increase in value? How can we accompany socially what that entails for the sector? So what we've done at IDRI is to work in France with the dairy sector and the crops sector, both primary production and processing. And here I come to a point mentioned by Eric that is extremely important. We don't have a lot of data on the jobs, incomes, and economic processes in the processing industry. And this is what we need, because if you think of a region like Brittany, in Brittany, the whole economy and the jobs that have not been transferred to other countries outside of Europe are industrial SMEs in mass Emmental cheese and mass ham. what is the future of those jobs? And they matter, of course, farmers matter. I'm not saying that they don't matter, but in terms of volumes of jobs, it's the same amount. And these are the jobs that we don't really know. So we try to gather data with the economics actors of these two types of sectors, dairy and crops. And we were able, with them, they were able actually to define economic strategies compatible with the objectives of rediversification, reintegration of livestock and crop. And actually, this study, and again, it's a scenario, so let's discuss what's in it and what should be discussed from that data. It's not a forecast, but it says that if we follow those economic strategies, you could have 10% more jobs in those sectors in France than on the business as usual. That relies a lot on also mechanization of the processing industries. So that's also thinking of what jobs and what types of technologies we want in the processing industry. And that part of the discussion is very often not on the table because we focus so much only on the farming sector. That matters definitely, but not only. Sorry for the microphone. So innovations are very important in that regard. I might come back to that, but I know that I'm nearly on time. So what are the policy? I think it's important to think that we need to discuss, if we take seriously that scenario, it's not that it's going to be easy to implement, but it's one scenario to discuss what are the framework of actions that we need to put around those economic actors if we want that to happen. So we need, of course, stabilized and solid markets and supply chains for rediversification. These are the ones that have been extremely difficult to establish for decades. So how would the change come? And I think this is more important a discussion than trying to renegotiate the targets themselves. What are the trade and competition policies that make that possible, and how can we arrange that internally and externally? That's very important. And the innovation support. So I think this is really this is to me the way to really understand the meaning of the Green Deal. The ambition of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork is to secure a viable future for our food system in a globalized world through a differentiation strategy on environment, on social, on top of the safety quality that is recognized for our food products. And for this, we need, of course, a food policy that should not be a taboo. We've begun the discussion on how we deal with consumers. I think this is really important, and we can think of the policies that deal with not only diets, but with the food environment, with public purchasing. So there are lots of elements on which I think we could develop more the chapters on that side. And I think that's one point on the food policy. We have that debate in France. Making nutritious food accessible to all is not rightly ensured by the downward trend on prices of food. And the downward trend on prices on food is actually not even good for the economic viability of farmers. So if we accept that food is going to become more expensive, then we need also to have a discussion on the social support to make nutritious food accessible to consumers. And that's about food stamps, that's about social security for food, which is a very vague concept behind which we need to discuss. But this needs to be on the table. And of course, the competition policy is really important. I agree with that, of course, very, very much with Christiane Lambert. We need a really common market to ensure that those who really make the effort to go for those strategies are not in competition internally with others in an unfair way. And of course, that leads back to how we ensure that the CAP subsidies are offering that level playing field through the eco scheme to reward quite in a as homogeneous a manner as possible across Europe, the conditionality and the support to more environmental ambition. And on trade, that's my last point. This is a very important discussion that is already ongoing, not just for agriculture. And I don't open that chapter, but I think that this is going to be heavily discussed with the French presidency of the European Union. And we have lots of ways to look at that, and we need to be consistent throughout the sectors. I mean, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is generally not discussed about agriculture, but all the food producers around us are looking at what we are going to decide on that. So we need to be very consistent on this.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that's a nice segue then to your fellow panelist, Nathalie Chaz, representing DG Santé, obviously, but in her title, international relations in there. And we're just on the cusp of going into the French presidency. So please, Nathalie, the floor is yours for your 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I will focus more on the Farm to Fork strategy. Just to reply, yes, this is really a comprehensive strategy as we see it. Our objective is to deliver significant improvement in the environment, in biodiversity, and in health by transforming the way we produce, we transform, we distribute, and we consume food. And in our discussion with the stakeholder, we don't really feel that there is so much of a challenge on the sense of the sense of direction of the objective. The discussion is much more about how and at what pace. And yes, there is a lot on farmers in the strategy. It's true, at primary production levels we have the target. We have a number of legislation we are preparing. First is a sustainable use of pesticide directive or animal welfare. We're also trying to promote innovations such as in feed additives. But really I would like to insist that the burden of change is not only on farmers, because the success of the change really depends on change at every step of the food chain. That's how we see it. And this is why we are indeed putting a lot of emphasis on changing the demand. And this can be done also, I mean, we also have a role to play at EU level, because we know that consumers, they want to contribute to the transition. However, for them, it's not necessarily easy to make the right choice, to know that they choose the healthy and sustainable food. One of the reasons is that we know very well we have to be realistic. The choice is made very quickly by consumers. They don't have so much time. And the choice is first determined by factors which are very well known. It is taste, it is convenience, it is price, it is habits. So if you want to change them, it's important to find the right approach, how to nudge them towards sustainable diets and how to nudge them towards more plant-based diets where we know it's necessary. And this is why we are preparing a number of initiatives for that goal. We have spoken about this. We have the nutrient profiles, which means that positive health messages will not be possible anymore for food that do not have really a healthy profile. And we do hope it will incentivize food manufacturers to reformulate their production. We are working on mandatory origin indication for some products, so to give information to consumers about where it was produced. And we all know we are preparing an impact assessment actually to revise the food for information to consumer regulation, also to look at front of pack labeling, nutrition labeling or date marking, this time to reduce a bit the food waste. But we all know very well that labeling is one tool, but only one tool. Indeed, what we know, it's usually recognized that what really influences largely the consumer choice, it is the food environment. It is how food choice is presented to them. And we know very well that the food system actors, which are the most influential on the consumer's choice, in shaping their behaviors, it's what we call the middle of the chain. It's the retailer, the manufacturer, food and drink manufacturers, it's the processor, it's the traders. The finance plays a role as well. And all these actors, we would like them to change as well. We know they have the greatest agency in the food system. So we have developed, let's say, we are designed two main tools at EU level. Once again at EU level, because all this needs also to be supported at national and local level, to push them a little bit, to nudge them as well towards sustainability. The first tool is a voluntary tool. It's a code of conduct on responsible food business and marketing practices. It was signed on 5th of July this year, and it was one of the first deliverables of the Farm to Fork strategy. It's a self-regulatory instrument whereby the actors, they made voluntary commitments towards sustainability and in transparency. And we have very diverse commitments, and sometimes it will relate to reformulation of food products. It can relate also to the internal processes of the company. It can be about reducing environmental footprint or food waste. And as of today, we have quite an encouraging number of signatories, around 100, but with a wide spectrum of food business, very different area. And we'll follow closely the implementation next year, especially when we have the first annual report, because it will contribute to give us a better understanding of what's happening. The code, however, it's clear will only be a success if we have more signatories, because we need a critical mass of participants to have a real impact. And then this will be accompanied by a second tool, which we are developing at the moment, and that's where the GRC Policy Lab study, which you referred to at the beginning, play a role. We are planning in 2023 a horizontal legal framework, which will really put sustainability at the heart of the food system. Let's say we see it a little bit like the General Food Law, which was developed some years ago, to really put food safety at the center of the food system, which had defined, what is the role and responsibility of the different actors. We will do a little bit the same. That's the plan, to define sustainability, to define the role and responsibility of all actors in the food chain, and to perhaps put a number of requirements, which we are discussing at the moment. We are preparing the impact assessment. We have published Inception impact assessment soon, and we have asked for expert input via the GRC study with experts. It was to give us a little bit of ideas, suggestion, point of view of the different stakeholders on what should be in that text. This is for 2023, so we are still in the planning. We will do public consultation, we will listen to all comments, but we see it as a major, let's say, legislative action to have impact across the whole food chain, again, from the beginning to the end. So this is to say we do have a lot of ambition. We believe we have a comprehensive strategy. It doesn't mean we are very ambitious. I don't know if this is the big, hairy, ambitious goal, but we are indeed fully aware we are ambitious. But we think it is necessary. We think success will depend on a combination of voluntary regulatory action at EU, national and local level, because we know that regulation alone, they do not change all behavior and habits. And we really want to flag this is a shared responsibility for us. Farmers are expected to produce sustainable. The food industry, suppliers, all manufacturers, they must help transforming, supplying food in a sustainable way, and consumers must be willing and enabled to choose a sustainable food provided to them. So we need all this change at all this level to succeed, but we also know we need to succeed for reasons already explained. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you very much indeed for sticking to the time slot as well. Appreciate that. So Dick, thank you very much for your patience. We're going to turn to you now, and you're going to present some slides on your farm management practices at Novi Farm, particularly the use of precision farming, I understand, and the reduction of fertilizer use. So Dick, in your own time, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ren. You can show the next slide, please. Next.
Next slide, please, for the technical team. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I try to do this within the 7 minutes, Rose. So I start with the crop rotation of Novi Farm, so you can see what our crops are. This is quite a sustainable crop rotation plan with about 25% of potatoes, as you can see on top. We also grow a lot of onions. It's important to mention this because this is really an export crop. As maybe a lot of people know, we export from the Netherlands about 1 million tons of onions each year to Africa, to Asia, to a lot of places in the world. Then the very sustainable part in our crop rotation is winter wheat and winter barley. It's about 45 to 50% of our total amount of hectares. And this is, I think, within the next, the plans for Farm to Fork, which will be implemented in all countries in a different way. This is a very important thing that these kinds of crops are in our crop rotation. And of course, we grow sugar beets, about 100 hectares, because sugar industry in Europe and also in the Netherlands is still very important because it's quite a cash crop for us. Besides that, we grow grass and flower strips. We already do this for about 10 years, and well, this is a really, I think, a good thing for biodiversity. Next. Our precision farming history goes back to 2010. From then on, we started with precision farming. We weren't we were no innovators, but I think we were more early adopters of precision farming. Today, 12 years later, we really implemented precision farming in our complete farm business. So we already plan at the office what we are going to execute in the field. I can show you in the next slide. Yes. So in winter times, we already make a plan for the next year. And this work is done on the office by, for instance, one of my other managing partners and one of our employees can do the work in the field in spring. So for us, this the whole GPS and precision farming thing makes life much easier. Next slide, please. We also collect a lot of data from our precision farming activities. As you can see, we can plant our for instance, our potatoes very precisely on the right spot. So we make task maps, and we can put this in our tractors. So the satellite knows exactly where our tractor is, and it can put, for instance, our seed potato on the right spot. Next. Beside this, we also can monitor the growth of our plants. We do this by sensor technology, and we try to get a very good total amount of plants per hectare. That's I think the most important thing. And we can also use this information which we collect by data, by sensors, for measuring the growth. Next slide, please. This is how we can measure our growth. So these sensors you can see on one of the photos, we put them into our systems, and the next step for measuring growth is to go to real-time fertilization by the sensor data. I can show you this on the next slide. Next, yes. For instance, this is our output we get from our computer, and with this information we can use less fertilizers, because we know exactly where we need fertilizers, where we need more fertilizer, or where we need less fertilizer. And in the end, we need about 10% less of fertilizer. That's approximately the outcome of 12 years of precision farming. Of course, it's all about yield. Next slide, please. This is also what we do at the end of the season. We put some really good sensors on our harvesting machinery, like this one, and we can see what the outcome is of the input what we did. So because we know exactly how many tonnages of potatoes we harvest on a certain spot, we know this gives us data for the next year. So the next year we know what we should do on that spot to make a better result. And in the end, with all this extra data, we will in the future need even less fertilizer. So there's a very strong connection between precision farming and the amount of fertilizer we use. And my time is up, I think, Rose.
Thank you very much, Dick. Thank you very much indeed for giving us, I think, an insight into your farm. And if I did a little bit of research before I came here, and Novi Farm is a partnership of arable farmers. And just to give an idea, am I right in saying that the total area is approximately 800 hectares? So we're talking large scale here. So you're really an example, Dick, I think, of how these decisions are going to, impact you on the ground as a farmer. But from what you say, on the basis of your precision farming and the methodologies that you have on site to reduce fertilizers alone, that you're going in a direction already that are more in keeping with the environment and more sort of conscious of the environment. So do you see how these kind of headline targets that we've talked about, whether it's chemical pesticides, whether it's the fertilizers, etc., do you see that it will impact your yields and your profit margins? Are you confident in the methodologies that you've adopted, that you have managed in such a way to keep yields and profits at a level that are sustainable for yourself as a farmer on the ground?
Well, until now, I can see that we managed to keep up the yields. But what's really worrying us is that especially the amount of pesticides which will in the future will reduce, because there are a lot of pesticides which will be not allowed anymore the next few years. This will give us an impact, because, for instance, a disease like Phytophthora, it's very hard to manage this. So we worry about the amount of pesticides we are allowed to use the next few years. This will have an impact on our yields for sure.
So you're referring there to sort of a qualitative impact in terms of toxins, the presence of toxins, or even food safety issues. And I guess that's a question then as well for Nathalie Schaz in terms of alternatives coming on stream for these pesticides that will be taken off the market. Okay, well, Dick, I'm going to leave it there for now, but I'm going to come back to you in due time. But I would like to take this opportunity to ask our online participants, for those of you who would like to ask a question, to get your question in on the question box that is at the bottom of the website that you are now joining. So there's a question box at the end if you scroll down just to get your question in. We'll be going to you in a moment. But first, back to my panelists, if I may. Nathalie, there's a lot of discussion at the moment, and Sébastien Treillet was discussing this at the end of his presentation. The French presidency is coming in at a very crucial time now in a couple of weeks. It's a presidential year, etc. And the big topic on the tip of everyone's lips is les clauses miroirs. And I am aware that the Commission is planning a report in terms of how we can encourage, let's say, third countries to embrace our standards and to make them as an integral part to sustainable trade deals with our third partners in the future. Where do you see the Commission going with this? We understand that the report is due in June 2022, but what realistically, is there going to be a disconnect again between the French aspirations of putting this on the agenda and what can actually happen in practice?
Okay, I don't think I'm going to comment on the French aspiration. What I can tell you is, yes, we are preparing a report which was asked by the co-legislator at the end of the negotiation on the CIP to look a little bit at the rationale and legal feasibility of applying our environmental standards to import. The situation today is that when it's about food safety or animal health, protection of animal health or protection of plant health, we can take measure at the border, like food that entered EU needs to comply with our food safety requirement. We have animal health requirement, we have plant health requirement. Now we are talking about something else, which is looking a little bit at how it was produced, not whether the food that entered the EU market presents risk, but how it was produced and whether we agree to import products that were produced that way. So in that context, we need to look at different rationale, and including at the international agreement we are part of. We cannot be arbitrary, we cannot be discriminatory. If we want to act, I think it was explained in the trade policy review of the Commission, we need a legitimate objective, which means we need a legitimate objective to act on imports. which means that our action needs to have, it needs to be justified by the objective which is beyond our borders. And we need also to be very much science-based. So we will be working on explaining, let's say, a bit more what is possible in the report. But I think we already know quite well what are the boundaries of what we can do. And everything needs to be assessed, I would say, on a case-by-case basis. I mean, you cannot have a blanket decision because you need to look at whether it's justified and whether it's legitimate and whether it's science-based.
And WTO compliant within all of that as well is a question governing.
Yep,
yes.
Which goes together.
Sure.
Because if you legitimate, it's easier.
Sure. Last month at the Farm to Fork conference in mid-October, your Commissioner Stella Kyriakides said that transition towards sustainable food systems must be global. But would it appear that our friends across the pond are on another strategy, that they're kind of adopting the alternative strategy called the Coalition for Productivity Growth? Now, I know that there was a joint platform that was launched recently between the EU and the US, and you might take this one, Tassos, that they launched this new transatlantic collaboration platform on boosting dialogue. But that's sort of a separate, as I would see. They've sort of critiqued, I would say, Tom Vilsack, the USDA Secretary, has critiqued our Farm to Fork strategy. What's your message to the US, Tassos? Or just in general, a commentary on that?
Well, as somebody that has studied in the US, well, first of all, I understand the logic of the focus on productivity. What I don't understand is why there is this perception that Europe is some sort of anti-productive. I mean, there clearly you can find arguments in Europe that are pretty much hesitant on the notion of productivity, but you find the same arguments in the United States of America, and they're driven by a very clear appreciation that we have that over the last decades, economic growth and social growth has come at the expense of the environment. And this is a common understanding on both sides of the Atlantic. So what we're talking about now is finding ways whereby we reduce our environmental footprint, we increase our environmental efficiency without at the same time compromising economic or social gains. Now, you would say this is nice to say, is it possible? I would say that OECD already, it was 2008 that coined this term jointness of the economic and environmental efficiency. And at the end of the day, this is something that you have to be able to measure on the ground. When you have different food production systems, obviously you have to measure different things, but I mean, and here is a big difference between the US and Europe. The US is a new world, and the new world you have land more abundant than you have in the old world. And therefore the production methods are different. But if we go back to the example of Dick, the important thing is what we measure. And what we measure is not just the reduction in the fertilizer use or pesticides. What we measure, and that's the target that we want to measure on the Farm to Fork, is nutrient balance in the soil. And here, both sides of the Atlantic and other parts of the world had a lot to show about what works and what doesn't work in very different conditions. And I think it's about time to start a dialogue on concrete ideas of what is happening on the ground instead of thinking that somehow we are worlds apart, which we are not, by the way. Maybe we're an ocean apart, but that's as far as it goes.
And Sébastien, just to pick up on your presentation, you were saying how we need to radically rethink national and global food systems. So then listening to what your panelists are saying from the European side, what's on the table, do you think the Farm to Fork strategy then is on the right track, looking at it from your academic perspective?
I mean, I would really concur with the idea that we need ambitious targets in the longer term, and that these need to translate into feasible milestones in 2030. And to my knowledge, I mean, I would, to some extent, I would react to Eric's mention of are these targets well designed? We've been having that discussion in the framework of COP15 on biodiversity to try and identify what is the equivalent for biodiversity of the ppm, of the concentration of greenhouse gases or the emissions of greenhouse gases, because that's a very easy way to have the equivalent tons of CO2. This is something that we would like to seek for in terms of biodiversity. And to me, the pressures on the environment that would be the equivalent of the tons equivalent CO2 are what what is in the Farm to Fork strategy for 2030. So I don't see here a logical or conceptual problem on the target. What I really want to insist on is from those targets, and maybe we need to discuss how ambitious we can be in 9 years. That was Tassos's main point. But I would really discuss not only marginal, I mean, Tassos was saying what we need is, I don't know if it's me moving, Tassos needs to, we're saying we need to see if we are taking the bifurcation, and then it will accelerate. And this is, I mean, I'm interpreting a little bit, and I'm sorry, Tassos, I should not be quoting you. You should be speaking for yourself. That's what I got from your what you were saying. And the whole discussion is: are we bifurcating rapidly enough to be there on the structural changes? One thing that struck me in the presentation by Dick on his farm is the level of diversity on the farm. This is something we've been struggling with in France, for instance, when we discussed to what extent the farmers that are doing carbon farming through conservation agriculture, how can they get also rid of glyphosate? And one farmer from the Academy of Agriculture was showing that she has a 7-year crop rotation through which she doesn't need glyphosate anymore. But then you need the markets behind that. And we are ending up in the discussion about what are the middlemen, the middle part of the chain who are designing the products of tomorrow, formulating the products of tomorrow. Are we able to discuss with them if they can really participate to designing the markets and the supply chains that we need for that farmer to have 7 different crops in her crop rotations? And I think that's the type of diversification discussion that I was alluding to, for which we really need to have a food systems perspective. So yes, I like the Farm to Fork the way it is. Let's see how we can help develop the other policy instruments that need to come with the strategy.
Sure. Thank you, Sébastien. Dick, just turning to you very briefly, a commentary there on how diversified your holding is. Looking ahead into your crystal ball, say the next 5 years, how do you see your holding evolve, let's say? How do you see that farm evolve in taking into account the sort of the new criteria that you'll have to be respecting and that? Do you see further changes ahead, or are you going to keep sort of the status quo in terms of the potatoes, the wheat, etc., that diversified list of crops?
Well, to be honest, one of our most important crops is potatoes, especially French fries potatoes. And you already mentioned the other system, which is the United States vision on future farming by Tom Vilsack. What our worry is that the way the Americans grow potatoes, French fries potatoes, it will be more cost efficient than in our area. In the Netherlands, we are part of we call it the Hafpal area, which is the area for growing French fries in Europe. So this is the area between Hamburg, Frankfurt, Paris and Le Havre. In this area, we grow a lot of French fries. If the new Green Deal will make the cost price too high to grow French fries, potatoes, then we lose our market to the Americans. And this is really an issue for our biodiversity strategy, because we need to make money to invest in biodiversity and sustainability. So who's going to pay the bill for the Green Deal? Is it us, our farmers? Is it the consumers? Who's going to pay the bill?
Okay, thank you for that, Dick. I'm slightly distracted there. We've got a number of questions coming through, but I'm just going to give just to Eric, if you don't mind, your observations from what has just been said. You sort of gave us the keynote address on the 18 months since the inception, or since the Farm to Fork strategy was tabled. On the basis of what was just said there, any observations or any sort of reactions to any of the speakers? And then I'm going to open up to the floor, and we have a microphone. We have an ELO colleague ready to help with the microphone. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll get you in one moment. So Eric, please.
Thank you. Well, two things. Well, one thing is indeed we have big, hairy, audacious goals. That's what we need. That's what we have. And they're in the long run, and indeed it's a detail on what exactly needs to happen in 9 years. So I'm happy to hear that. We're on the right track. The second thing is, I think there's a coordination issue, a time coordination issue. When Sébastien says what we need to develop supply chains for pulses, I'm not sure whether you mean for animal feed or human feed, or both. But of course, demand needs to. Well, there is a danger that if you develop them too quickly and demand is not following, well, then the prices of these pulses will just go down. Right? So there's a huge timing problem, coordination problem, where everything has to advance at the same time. And there's a danger for a chicken and egg problem and not doing anything, and we should not fall into that danger. But it means that these demand-side policies have to be also big, hairy, and audacious, and again need to involve member states to get there. That's kind of my true. And then, yeah, of course, the middle problem that I indicated has been, I think, also confirmed. That the food environment, which is much more than just labels, it's also, again, how things are formed, how a city is laid out. So it involves many actors that need to go in the same direction.
Okay, thank you for that, Eric. So now, ladies and gentlemen, who would like to pose the first question? Hands up, please. Ariel Brunner, the floor is yours.
Ariel Brunner from BirdLife Europe Environmental NGO. A couple of hours ago, the Parliament voted for a CAP that is basically just business as usual. It's a complete rebranding of the previous reform with a bit of fresh green paint. And our preliminary analysis of the CAP strategic plans is that broadly speaking, member states are will be investing the CAP money in business as usual and not in any of the kind of transformational change that everybody here seems to agree on. So the change is not going to come through the investment of the huge amount of money of the CAP. Eric mentioned the taxonomy. There is a huge pressure to fake the taxonomy so that everything will be green, and that means that we will not even get the green investments to flow into the agricultural change. So how do you see the change happening before the catastrophe arrives, because the catastrophe is already coming? And isn't it really that the only thing left to us is good old hard command and control legislation, basically forbidding certain practices in order to create the space for better practices? And in many cases, it's not even about new legislation, it's even just starting enforcing the current legislation, because if we were enforcing on farming the Birds and Habitats Directive, the Water Framework Directive, the Nitrates Directive, the SUD, and so on, it would be a completely different farming, and a good chunk of those targets would be achieved immediately. Thank you.
And who's the question directed to, Ariel?
Well, really, I mean, maybe just because Eric mentioned the taxonomy, the question might be for him, but you can pick whoever you think. Because
well, if Eric,
until now, we've heard basically big love and harmony. Everybody agrees about the directive, or the direction of travel. Everybody agrees we need to reinvent farming very quickly. But this is not at all what the political system is doing at the moment.
Okay, well, Eric and Tassos, I think, just one thing as well. When you're posing a question for for the participants online, be sure to get the microphone as close to you as possible so that our friends online can also hear. So, Eric, please, in response to that question from Ariel.
Yes, well, two quick things. On the green taxonomy, I may have expressed a hope rather than a reality, based on, of course, also what some companies are doing. So it's not that everybody is the bad guy. There are also hopeful things happening. So let's also work on reputation, and that's maybe also NGOs should play a role in getting the reputation of companies. You're doing that already, but maybe we should be going back there. But my second point is, and it's a question for the other speakers, is indeed about the instruments. I mean, if we are, we've been talking about targets, but with what instruments? I mean, how are we going to get the incentives right? As an economist, I was thinking more about taxes. a pesticide tax, a nitrogen tax, or things like that. And I'm not hearing that conversation yet, but that's something that I was really looking forward to. Yeah.
Tassos?
Well, the easy targets. First of all, I think what you just mentioned, Ariel, is a decision that is being taken by one of the co-legislators. Now, we like it or we don't like it, it's about time that we realize that we have to deal with an environment of 27 member states and a process that takes longer than we would have liked. And if I were, and maybe that's what I would be doing when I retire, to sit in my own office, I could design a perfect policy on paper. The reality is always very different. So with this new policy that will come into play, will things are going to change or not? If you were to ask Dick, he will not take the point that you have taken and the need to use the term catastrophe everywhere. It's one thing to have targets and want to do things that we don't see materialize. It's another thing to consider nothing will change. For example, it's not by accident that we didn't propose ring fencing. We didn't propose ring fencing because we wanted to give a lot of flexibility to member states to choose what is best for them and be able to measure on the ground what they're doing. Now that ring fencing came in, and by the way, it came in with a lot of the pressure coming from NGOs like yours, we arrive at a situation where the criticism is the opposite. But look at what they're doing with ring fencing. They want to use all the money, and they're doing greenwashing. The reality could be somewhere in the middle, because it's obvious that ring fencing will put challenges in terms of addressing and assessing what exactly is going to be done on the ground. But it's also true that we do have a series of indicators that will be able to allow us to measure what is happening on the ground. And what is happening on the ground is not going to dig and other farmers and look individually on what they're going to do, although we will have a network like that, but look globally at what the member states will have to demonstrate that they're doing. And if the discussion that we're going to have about the Common Agricultural Policy strategic plans is before we even see and receive these plans that they have already failed, then obviously there is something that is wrong. But what is wrong is the manner by which we have this debate on public. We have a debate that is not based on facts, but it's based on opinions. And we start with a certain opinion, we declare that something is wrong, and we take it for granted. And there is a big difference between evidence and self-evidence. And sometimes facts are more stubborn than the opinion that each one of us has.
I'm going to open the floor again. Liam McHale up in the front row, the Irish Farmers Association. Please, if we could get a microphone over to this gentleman, please. And I would ask Dr. Peter Stroh-Schneider, we will be coming to you in a moment. We've just got a little bit of momentum here in the studio, so we're just going to ask some more questions, and I'm going to go to some online questions, but we will be back to you in about 5 minutes, okay? So please be patient. Thank you, Dr. Peter. So Liam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rose. Eric mentioned early on in relation to data and the need for food systems to work in an inclusive way. And I picked up from DJ Sante and from Natalie the Code of Conduct for Responsible Business and Marketing Practices and a voluntary measure. And yet your colleague over in DG Agri, Tassos, told us that the big retail haven't provided potential information and data that could help in the promotion of healthier eating choices, etc. So my question is, what needs to happen for big retail, for industry, and other players outside of farmers in the food system to change and to recognize this need to work together if we're going to reach the targets in Farm to Fork in the Green Deal? Thank you.
Yeah, Natalie, if you want to respond on that Code of Conduct.
The Code of Conduct, it's an offer we gave to the industry to take voluntary commitments and show that they are contributing. I think we look at it as a result-oriented instrument. We want to see whether it will have an impact. Voilà. So it's an invitation to them, but it is an invitation to show also results, let's say. We don't ask them to give us data. You know the difficulty why they don't give data. For them, it's very business commercial secret even for some of them. So you don't get easily data from them on consumers, what consumers purchase. But we are aiming with this code to have a result-oriented process. As I say, we have a little bit two pillars. We have the code of conduct and the legislation. So we are now in the process of designing the legislation. We will look at what comes out of the code when we design the legislation. So it's, let's say, an invitation to show result, and also a clear message that if you don't show result, we probably need to discuss with member state what else to do. You know. So this is a little bit how we are proceeding with them at the moment. We know they have much more information than us. They have a lot of agency. They have also a lot of power on primary producers as much as on consumers. We tell them, you have to show, you have to contribute, show us what you can do, and I mean, we will all look at the result, let's say, and we will discuss the result with all stakeholders, not just with the signatories.
Okay, another question over here for Greenpeace, Marco Contiero. Please, this gentleman in the front, please. And then we're going to take a question from our online participants, okay?
Thanks a lot, Marco Contiero from Greenpeace. I have a question maybe for Natalie, and then another one for Sébastien. The one from Natalie would be on the fact that basically science is consistently telling us that we need to reduce the consumption of certain products, including meat and dairy products. And I haven't seen in the Farm to Fork there is a mention about dietary changes, but it's quite light, so to say. Will the Commission in the next in the next 2-3 years, start looking into setting targets, for example, to reduce consumption and production of certain products, and making sure that farmers are not the ones that will pay the price for that reduction? And for Sébastien, you mentioned something which I think is crucial, is the difference between value increase and volume increase. The market currently is very poorly rewarding volume increases or volume production. Have you, in your analysis, come across good examples of way to internalize externalities? Because that is a way in which we can bet on values instead of relying on volumes of cheap food, which doesn't benefit anybody. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that, Marco. So the two questions, maybe Natalie, if you'd like to go first.
I think what we would like indeed is to rebalance the overall diet. We know that half of the population in Europe is overweight. We know that for a lot of people, the diet is not balanced, too much based on protein and animal-based protein. But we also know that there are a lot of people in Europe, sorry, I don't have the figure in my head, cannot afford a proper meal every second day. So in reality, what we're really aiming at is a bit of a rebalancing. We would like, affordable and accessible food for all, not to have a situation in Europe where people still don't have enough food, and others have a really unbalanced diet. So really the objective also is not only environmental, it's also health, in the sustainability of food system, and we would like to do what we can to promote change of diet at population level, but nevertheless the choice remains an individual choice. So it's about incentive, let's say, and we'll try to do so. There are different ways. You can use public procurement, and you can use also the food environment is very important, as we said, but we are fully aware. Yeah.
Sébastien?
I know I need to be short. Just to answer Marco's question is very important. Actually, I think the best way to look at how you introduce value and not just volume is Italy rather than France. If you look at how the SMEs in Italy in food production are able to capture value, this is an example that we should study much more. The problem is that in France, very often the example that we have is Comté cheese, which is a very good cheese, by the way. And I'm not from there. But it has enabled a very strong narrative about value, environmental quality, and local production, etc. And you can't just use Comté cheese for the Emmental cheese producers of Brittany, because that's a completely different model. What we have computed, and so maybe we need to seek other examples than the ones existing within France to justify that. The numbers that we have in our studies is that with the dairy production companies in France, and not looking at a pure Comté strategy that is extremely niche, we were able to see that you could re-diversify, reintegrate, and change the model of production and the strategy to have less volume and more value, and at the same time, and ensuring with a little bit of support from the CAP, not changing drastically the income of people, and still maintaining, so with lower levels of production, income is maintained. This, of course, is not robust enough. I mean, Christiane Lambert, when she discussed our study, she just said, I don't believe in studies. But then the problem is nevertheless, we need to discuss things, and I think Tassos was showing that we need to open up the way we discuss things. But then our study nevertheless shows that there is something that we can build that does not necessitate the Comté story to be able to reduce volumes and find incomes. And this is on which I think we need to continue the discussion with the dairy sector in France. And we are now looking at other, like the meat sector that is extremely under pressure, not just beef, but also pork and poultry.
Thank you for that, Sébastien. So I'm going to go now, with your permission, just to a question online from Alan Buckwell from the RISE Foundation, very prominent figure in this debate. Perhaps, Tassos, I'll put the question to you. So it's just quite lengthy, so just bear with me. Does the panel agree that a food system which internalises, echoing what Marco said, that a food system which internalises the damage of the current system to climate stability, water quality, biodiversity and health will inevitably involve higher farm gate and probably retail food prices? So continuing on from Marco's question earlier on.
Oh. Well, I do not necessarily think that, and here I'm talking about my personal opinion, this is the case in every single sector we're talking about. Because whether you have higher or lower prices is a combination of how the supply and the demand curves are going to shift. And for the same reason that tastes changes in tastes and preferences are not uniform, they're sector-specific, country-specific, generational-specific, and can move to the left or the right. For the same reason, you can do in the supply curve shifts that do not necessarily increase the cost of production, because technologies allow you to reduce the marginal cost of production and be more environmentally efficient, internalizing some of the costs. But it all depends on practices, and it all depends on the specific situations. So, as part of the panel, I would say that we cannot generalize, especially in such a complex system.
Okay, thanks for that, and I hope Alan is happy with that question. And the final one, just to yourself, Eric. I asked earlier, is the farm to fork strategy on track? I think it was to Sébastien I posed the question. Alan Buckwell wants to know, is the Green Deal on track? It's sort of more of a broader look again. So, and of course, the farm to fork is a flagship within that. No pressure, Eric, but.
Well, I want to maybe flag one thing that is, it was mentioned earlier, farming, agriculture, part of the food system is not included in ETS, for example. And, you know, are we not missing an important leverage point to get incentives right, but also get money flowing into the sector? So I would say, so my answer is a bit different. It's like, well, let's open up the Green Deal to, you know, non-ETS sectors, such that we can accelerate also in these sectors a move towards, well, not neutrality, because in agriculture it will be a different story anyway.
Were you surprised to see that agriculture wasn't included in the carbon border tax that Sébastien discussed earlier on, that was one of the sectors that actually isn't included within agriculture?
Well, of course, one is related to the other.
Yeah,
I
sure.
mean, so it's not a surprise, but I think it is one way, because carbon is relatively easy to measure relative to other impacts. It's kind of, I think, the way forward.
Okay. I'm going to go to another question to Dick, and then I'm going to hand over the floor to our very patient Dr. Peter Strohschneider. A question from, just bear with me for a moment. You mentioned the fact that there may be some diseases, some toxins that will become prevalent now that some pesticides aren't available online. What about, are new breeding techniques something on your radar, and would you like to see new breeding techniques come on stream more freely for farmers such as yourself? And that question comes in from Eric van der Zomen. So, Dick, is that something that you've been thinking about in terms of new breeding techniques? It's also, I suppose, for Nathalie, but we'll put it to yourself, Dick.
Well, of course, new breeding techniques will help to grow better quality crops in the future. But we have in the Netherlands, we have a lot of experience with new breeding techniques because there are a lot of companies involved in this. And to have a new breeding technique, it takes about 15 years. I think it also takes 15 years to develop a biological pesticide. Again, the time is too short to develop new techniques to have an answer to the current chemical pesticides. And that's our problem. The next few years, we can use less chemical pesticides, and there's no alternative yet. So this alternative will be there maybe between 2030 and 2030, but not earlier.
Okay, thank you. As you say, it's a question of timeline and getting those on stream quite quickly. So I'm going to wrap up the Q&A session with your permission. Apologies, we're off schedule slightly, but I think you would agree that it was a lively and dynamic debate, so no regrets there.